Vienna around 1900, the capital of the Habsburg monarchy, was the undisputed metropolis of Austria-Hungary, the second biggest country in Europe. With 2 million inhabitants, Vienna was the world's 5th largest city.
At the turn of the 20th century, Vienna was in many respects a glittering and incredibly appealing city, a virtual magnet for migrants. It was a vibrant metropolis in every sense. What made Vienna so special around 1900 was that, as great literary figures like Karl Kraus and Hermann Brock put it, the city was a test station of the apocalypse. Yet, at the same time, a cradle of epoch-making trends and achievements of the modern era.
People flocked to the imperial city from all parts of the monarchy. In May 1906, a 17-year-old youth from Linz also made his way to Vienna. He was overwhelmed by the size and splendor of the city's Ringstraße. He had quit secondary school in Steyr. He had no job and had come to the capital in search of artistic edification. At the court opera, he attended a pioneering production by Gustav Mahler of Richard Wagner's Lohengrin. But Adolf Hitler had to go back to the extremely provincial town of Linz. It was not until 1907 that his mother and his guardian allowed him to move to Vienna. 18 years of age, with no training and no job prospects, he took a tiny room in a dark back building in the Stumpergasse. He was a subtenant in the home of Maria Zaklai, who came from Moravia.
Oder Zikorienkaffee, ganz wie Sie wünschen. Dazu Wasser zum Waschen. Da wohne ich. Und hier haben Sie Kabinett. Ja, Licht aus Hinterhof ist nicht sehr günstig. Aber dafür haben Sie vorzügliche Petroleumlampe, noch angeschafft von meinem Selin. Na, wie gefällt Ihnen?
Right from the start, he had this air of an artist about him, something of a bohemian as well. In a way, he was also like that in Linz, but in Vienna, this bearing was definitely more pronounced. In the first 2 years, I'd say, he moved around the city with a certain self-confidence, feeling that he would make it and become an artist.
The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts on the Schillerplatz. The 18-year-old applied for entry by presenting drawings he had brought from Linz. He was convinced that he would be accepted at the academy. His greatest desire was to become an artist. Not for a second did he doubt his abilities, but he had massively overestimated his talent. His sample drawings did not meet the Academy's high demands. He had faithfully depicted buildings and landscapes, but none of his works portrayed even a single person. Professor Christian Griepenkerl, who came from Oldenburg in Germany, turned down Hitler's application.
Der Mappe ist nichts, was darauf hindeuten würde, dass Malerei ein Ausdrucksmittel ihrer Person sein könnte. Lassen Sie es besser.
In his report, Professor Griepenkerl simply noted, "Sample drawing unsatisfactory, too few heads." This rejection was a bitter blow for the 18-year-old. He had no plan B.
Basically, the young man had no clear idea of what direction he wanted to take. He often spoke of becoming a painter, but it's obvious that he was subject to a wide range of artistic influences. If we're to believe his contemporaries, the way he collected themes and dealt with material was extremely uncoordinated. In addition to music, he concentrated heavily on painting, but also on architecture. So it's quite clear that focusing solely on painting at the Academy of Fine Arts just wouldn't work out.
Adolf Hitler made a second attempt, but he was not even invited to provide a sample drawing. Fascinated by the glamour of the city, the school dropout had no desire to return to bourgeois Linz. It would be an admission of his failure and his inadequacy. He spent hours wandering around on the Ringstrasse. The neo-Greek Parliament building fascinated him. He too wanted to build and to plan. Full of enthusiasm, he sent postcards to his only friend, August Kubitschek, in Linz. Hitler wanted his fellow opera fan to move to Vienna. A music lover and apprentice decorator, Kubitschek was the only person Adolf had contact with.
He fantasized, seeing himself not so much as an architect who really built things, but I think as someone who could redesign entire cities, someone who thought in vast dimensions. This is clearly indicated by his idea of completing the Imperial Forum, of extending the Imperial Palace, which to this day has never been enlarged, of creating a new Imperial Palace, so to speak. He told his friend Kubitschek that this fascinated him. It would create a parade square of incredible size.
The unfinished Imperial Forum became the Heldenplatz. Hitler now wanted to become an architect, or at least a master builder. Once again, he applied for admission to the academy.
Ja, wenn Linz beim nächsten Erdbeben einstürzt, nach diesen Ihren Plänen könnte man es wieder aufbauen. Bis ins unbedeutendste Detail wieder aufbauen. Ja, in Gottes Namen. Wie schaut denn das Maturazeugnis aus?
Matura?
Da heißt das Reifeprüfung bei Ihnen in Linz, wie bei den Deutschen. Keine Matura.
Hitler quit the secondary school in Linz and later the school in Steyr. In fact, he had to leave because his academic performance and discipline were unacceptable. He was quick-tempered and dogmatic. In Vienna, he lived off the 25 crowns he drew as an orphan's allowance following his mother's death and had to share with his 11-year-old sister. The Vienna of the fin de siècle was the Vienna of the aristocracy, the imperial city, the Vienna of the modern era. The other Vienna was reflected in the lives of the hundreds of thousands of migrants from Bohemia, Hungary and Galicia. In this multi-ethnic city, two extremes collided, the dawning of the modernism era and conservative traditions.
Du hast ein Konglomerat.
We're talking about a conglomeration. This is demonstrated by figures who stood for modern trends, modern intellectual life or political life. At the same time, in Vienna, you had a Sigmund Freud, a Gustav Mahler, a Leo Trotsky, and an Adolf Hitler. Certainly a conglomeration that was extremely headstrong and fascinating. This was the domain of one of the founders of modern socialism, physician to the poor and psychiatrist Victor Adler. There was this truly wayward interplay between forces that were widely differing, yet at the same time mutually dependent. It was, I think, a hugely definitive factor in the Vienna of 1900. You could describe it as the laboratory of the modernism.
Könnte man sagen, Labor der Moderne.
A laboratory of the modern era, but also a testing ground for the apocalypse, as writer Karl Kraus mocked. Against his wishes, in 1908, Emperor Franz Joseph celebrated his Diamond Jubilee with a ceremonial procession, but the occasion was marked by national tensions in a monarchy that was breaking up.
1908 was a key year. Hitler was already in Vienna. He saw and experienced everything, the annexation crisis and the problems of celebrating the Jubilee. The emperor tended to be withdrawn, attending to as little as possible. The plan was to stage a festival of homage, but disputes arose, even during the preparations, as to who should foot the bill. But above all, as to who would participate and who wouldn't.
The Czechs boycotted the homage procession, nor did the Hungarians travel to Vienna, and for its citizens the admission prices were too high, so the stands had to be filled with school children. Thousands were enticed to Vienna from far-off provinces. Also in 1908, an international crisis broke out with the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. There was even the threat of a European war breaking out.
The event really was a source of trouble. Folklore was prominent. The homage procession was a major folk parade, and it hid the major problems.
By 1908, the year Hitler failed to embark on an artistic career in Vienna, the Habsburg monarchy was already doomed. The multinational structure of Czechs, Italians, Poles, Ruthenians, Southern Slavs and German nationalists was held together solely through the figure of the old emperor. The marriage of his great-nephew Karl, who was supposed to succeed him in 1916, was celebrated by the high aristocracy of the empire. Some of the wedding guests possibly suspected already that the end was near.
In my opinion, the end of the monarchy began at the latest in 1897 with the Badeni crisis, named after the Prime Minister, an ethnic Pole. The crisis was triggered by the issuance of 2 language ordinances for civil servants in Bohemia and Moravia, who then had to be able to speak Czech as well as German. This mobilized not only German nationalists, but also Christian socialists on a broad scale in every important town in the monarchy.
In allen wichtigen Städten auch der Monarchie.
The Imperial Council of 1907, constituted for the first time under free and equal voting rights, became an arena for nationality conflicts. Parliament was hamstrung for months. The German-speaking deputies in particular felt forced into a corner.
The period around 1907 and 1908 is just as inherently contradictory as the entire fin de siècle. On the one hand, major democratic successes were achieved, like male suffrage, which was approved in principle in 1905 and formulated exactly over the next 2 years to become political practice. But there were also the major language crises, the nationalities conflict. So we now have a parliament elected in accordance with the law on male suffrage, but one which at the same time was hamstrung by the language and nationalities conflict. So on the one hand, you have a great victory for democracy, but one which is paid for by political life being paralyzed.
The Imperial Council chamber in the Vienna Parliament building. Hitler attended several sittings. After all, he had enough time on his hands. The 18-year-old was repulsed by day-to-day political business. Nascent parliamentarianism showed its less attractive side, with Ruthenian deputies blocking debates with speeches lasting hours.
Wie dieser österreichische Staatskadaver auseinandergezerrt wird im Nationalitätenkampf. Traurig. Mir kann's gar nicht schnell genug gehen. Du, gestern hättest du dabei sein sollen. Ich war wieder hier im Parlament. Nichts wie Obstruktionsreden, stundenlang. Was? Obstruktionsreden. Da redet ein Abgeordneter nur, damit niemand anderer zum Reden kommt. Und zwar Tschechisch und Ungarisch und Italienisch und Serbokroatisch, was weiß ich. Jeder von diesen politischen Profitgeiern vertritt hier im Reichsrat die Belange irgendeines von unseren PT-Gastvölkern.
Hitler observed some stormy sittings of the Imperial Council. Speakers were interrupted by banging and heckling. It's even said that inkwells were thrown. However, all really important decisions were taken by the changing governments of the emperor.
In Mein Kampf, he wrote that Parliament, as it is practiced in Britain, certainly has something appealing and interesting to it. But when you look at the Austrian Imperial Council, it's just useless.
The Deutsches Volksblatt, the only daily newspaper mentioned later by Hitler in Mein Kampf, reported on one sitting of the House of Deputies which Hitler had watched from the public gallery. The offices of this anti-Semitic German nationalist newspaper were located not far from Hitler's lodgings.
Naturally, he supported the radical German nationalists and said that through the new law establishing universal suffrage, the German nationalists have lost influence. How can that be? After all, they are the constitutive people. They are the ones who generate the lion's share of the tax yield, so they ought to be the ones taking the decisions.
With some 70,000 inhabitants, in 1908 Linz was a provincial town characterized by small-scale enterprises. It had a tobacco factory, breweries and an army barracks, but as yet no major industry. Hitler's family lived in a lower middle class area. In Linz, German nationalist sentiments were prevalent everywhere. The resentment of the German populace was directed first and foremost at their neighbours to the north, the Czechs.
Where German nationalism is concerned, I think that Adolf Hitler was heavily influenced by the atmosphere in Linz. There was no alternative. People in his environment were all either German liberals or already confirmed German nationalists. And according to Lubitschek and other sources, even in Linz he already had contact not only with moderate and liberal German nationalists or liberal forces, but also with radical German nationalist elements.
Adolf Hitler was born in Braunau on the border with Bavaria. His father was a customs official who lived for many years in Passau and later in Leonding. An authoritarian figure, he shaped his son's view of the world.
Alois Hitler, his father, was also a German nationalist. In addition to his job, he also acted as party secretary to the German nationalists in Leonding.
First and foremost, young Adolf experienced love from his mother, Clara, and cared for her in the final months of her battle against cancer. Only 2 class photographs from his childhood have survived. Little Adolf is seen on both on the back row. After junior school, Hitler attended the Imperial Secondary School in Linz. Although he was not an unintelligent child, he still had to repeat his first year. He had trouble fitting in. When playing cowboys and Indians, he tried to boss the other children about. At the state secondary school, he got to know a highly intelligent lad called Ludwig von Wittgenstein. Adolf's history teacher Leopold Pötsch, who was a German nationalist but still loyal to the House of Habsburg, influenced him.
I described the spirit of the school as nationalist, and Hitler's interest in such things stemmed from Professor Leopold Pötsch, who gave very good lectures on nationalist issues.
The main square in Linz and the old Danube bridge across to Urfahr. Every day Hitler would walk down the road with his friend August Kubitschek, chatting about opera performances and a girl called Stefanie Isaac.
Hitler, it seems, was so interested in my husband that he visited him every day and walked down the road with him so that he could see Stefanie. I don't think he had the courage to actually speak to her. My maiden name was Stefanie Isaac. I lived in Urfahr next to the bridge. I would often walk down the road with my mother, but never on my own. I can't remember ever having seen anyone called Adolf Hitler. But one day I did receive a letter from someone who said he was going to the Academy of Art in Vienna. It said that afterwards he would come back to Linz and marry me. The letter didn't make any impression on me. A lad of 14 or so was of no interest to me whatsoever.
So it remained a case of pure love from a distance. The 2 boys saw the girl, accompanied by her mother, nearly every afternoon. But that was it. Young Adolf never spoke to her, yet he believed that she loved him. It was the sublime, pure love he knew from the operas of his idol, Richard Wagner. Debate at the universities was being influenced more and more by German nationalist groups. The originally nationalist liberal fraternities had become increasingly radical. Finally, Jewish fellow students were excluded.
What took place in the fraternities? Students revelled in the Germanic myths and the feeling of solidarity with the Germans. And I'd say, because there was nothing like it in the German Empire itself, there was this attitude of, we are showing that we are Germans, and we are excluding the Jews because they are un-German.
The rooms of the fraternities echoed to the sound of Germanism being extolled in song. At the universities, fights often broke out between Jewish and Catholic students. Georg Ritter von Schönerer was the Pan-German's figurehead. He rejected the multi-ethnic state of the Habsburgs. The 10 million or so Germans in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy should, he felt, be incorporated into the German Empire. Hohenzollern instead of Habsburg. The squire of Rosenau Palace in the northern part of the Waldviertel region, Schönerer combined his admiration for Bismarck and his German nationalist policies with progressive social experiments. Through the constant radicalization of his language, he lost supporters and influence and elections, but not self-confidence. In the palace, he had himself depicted as Jupiter, the father of the gods. Following a raid on the offices of a newspaper, Schönerer was arrested and sent to prison.
1881.
The radicalization process in Schönerer began in 1881 and was completed in 1885. As a, it must be said, modern politician, he saw that the parties of the masses were beginning to form. And he recognized two things that are really fascinating. That the two groups which had been left behind since the entire modernization of 1867, since the December Constitution, were firstly the progressive element, the fraternities, which said they wanted to destroy the Habsburg monarchy and incorporate the German section of the populace into the greater German Empire.
Die sagen, wir wollen die Habsburger Monarchie zerstören und den Anschluss der deutschen Teile an das Großdeutsche Reich.
On the other side were the tradespeople, the lower middle classes, who were terrified of sinking into a proletariat role. Schönerer managed to bring these two blocks together and become their mouthpiece, and the two blocks were held together by anti-Semitism.
Und die werden vom Antisemitismus zusammengehalten.
In 1882, Schönerer's manifesto for the Pan-Germanic movement was published in Linz, a hodgepodge of German nationalist, social, racist and anti-Semitic views. The Pan-Germans rejected the Habsburg dynasty and called for the monarchy's German-speaking regions to be incorporated into Bismarck's German Empire. In the Waldviertel region, Schönerer had a Bismarck tower erected, a defiant monument to the salvation which he hoped Germanness would bring. Hitler spent lots of time in warm rooms, as they were known, and in Vienna's countless coffee houses. There he focused intently on Schönerer's ideas. In Vienna, anti-Semitism was by no means unique to the German nationalists. Even the city's Christian social mayor, Karl Lueger, stirred up hatred of the Jews.
Christian social and clerical publications adopted highly anti-Semitic positions, which Hitler can't have overlooked if he regarded Vienna's mayor, Karl Lueger, as a tribune, and if he recognized that basically every political camp and every figurehead he saw as decisive was centered on anti-Semitism and on racial anti-Semitism through Schönerer.
Ernst Vegani, the founder of the anti-Semitic Deutsches Volksblatt, supported Lueger's Christian social policies.
The Deutsches Volksblatt also played a major role in Lueger's rise in the 1890s. It was one of the few newspapers which Hitler said he had read on a regular basis. With what we know about his later development, it seems amazing that he regarded the Deutsches Volksblatt as a bit too wild, even with regard to its anti-Semitic rabble-rousing.
In Vienna, Hitler never had a steady job. He slept long and spent the days in coffee houses in the suburbs, reading newspapers and obscure magazines. He devoured anything that corresponded to his fixed opinion and simply blanked out anything to the contrary. Vienna in 1900 didn't just celebrate the birth of the modern era, it was a city of con-men and charlatans who combined crude racism with esotericism.
Adolf Hitler was a good example of the not particularly educated reader who fashioned a world for himself from various pamphlets, brochures, anti-Semitic writings and media reports.
Agitationsschriften und Medienberichten so eine Welt zusammenbaut.
One of these sources was the Ostara magazine. Named after a Germanic goddess of spring, it was written mainly by the self-styled Ariosopher Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, who, through pure breeding, wanted to save the noble Aryan race from perdition. It's quite possible that Hitler read the magazine.
There is this incredibly edited version of Mein Kampf which shows quite clearly that Adolf Hitler formulated his ideology from various hackneyed ideas. What is hard to determine today, I think, is what was based on his experiences in Vienna and what he had already brought with him from Linz, or what germinated in him during the First World War. But in my opinion, the really major formative period was the time after 1918. In
Hitler's formative years, Vienna was governed by Christian social mayor Karl Lueger. A charismatic figure, Lueger presented himself as a man of the people, surrounded by his Viennese associates, who were always a fun crowd. But Lueger also shaped the city. With Otto Wagner, he created the structures for a metropolis of 2 million people. Modern-day Vienna.
From now to his death, these were Lueger's great years. At first, his relationship with the High Church and the Habsburg dynasty wasn't exactly smooth. I'm referring to the rambunctious ruffians who appealed to the middle class or the petty bourgeoisie, not exactly the representatives of the Habsburg monarchy. It was this period that produced Lueger and racial anti-Semitism, or at least pronounced anti-Semitism in various forms.
Preparations at Lower Austria's House of History of an exhibition entitled The Formative Years of a Dictator. Karl Lueger was an important role model for young Adolf. In his populist rhetorical style, Lueger focused on the ordinary artisan's fears of social relegation. Under him, the Christian socialists became the mass party of the little man.
Hitler regarded Lueger as the greatest German mayor of all time. He derived his anti-Semitism from Führer, but he criticized both men. Lueger, he argued, is a genius. He has identified the soul of the masses, but his anti-Semitism is not honest. After all, he doesn't do anything. Schöner's anti-Semitism, on the other hand, is honest, but he has no idea of the soul of the masses. The logical conclusion from this, of course, was for the two to be merged, to create a great leader figure, a Führer.
It was at the opera that the 20-year-old Adolf found great symbolic leader figures. The director of the court opera, Gustav Mahler, and his scene designer, Alfred Roller, revolutionized performance practice. They produced Wagner's Tristan and Isolde as a synthesis of the arts, creating illusory spaces that had never been seen before. Together with his friend Kubitschek, Hitler often went to the opera several times a week.
Hitler, remember, wasn't Wagner's only fan. First and foremost, Wagner really did offer pubescent young men who were somewhat disappointed with life and unhappy in other ways a large number of possibilities for connecting. Wagner was seen as this child prodigy who had always had to struggle through against a hostile environment. Someone who was always in financial difficulties with some creditor or other after him. A revolutionary who in 1848 risked his career in support of a good cause.
Geldnot permanent, irgendwelche Gläubiger, die auf den Fersen sind. Ein Revolutionär, der 1848.
This was a figure Hitler could not only really relate to, but someone whose life he felt reflected much of his own problematical biography.
Problematischen Biografie auf einmal wiedergesehen hatte.
The staircase at the Vienna Court Opera. For Hitler, it was the ascent to a sanctuary. Watching Richard Wagner's operas from his standing place, he felt this exaltation of noblest humanity. Wagner's music had a greater political impact in Vienna than in Bayreuth.
At the time, the Wagner cult was something extremely universalizing. How shall I put it? In Vienna, there was a heroization and asceticization of all things German.
In 1850, Wagner had published his highly anti-Semitic essay, Jewishness in Music. Even though some time had passed since then, it is nonetheless amazing that he was still received and even feted in Jewish circles in Vienna. In my opinion, at the time, anti-Semitism had not yet been precisely formulated. People were not fully aware of the large number of levels at which anti-Semitism found expression.
The director of the court opera, Gustav Mahler, was a Jew, and many opera-goers belonged to Vienna's Jewish upper class. They too listened to Wagner.
It was obvious that Wagner's music held a clear political message. Over and above his writings, his entire program was German. Heroism, ancient German myths, Germanness. It all fitted in perfectly with the time.
Hitler wanted an opera that Wagner had planned but never written. At this time, August Kubitschek was already studying at the conservatory and had heard of just such a Wagnerian project.
In Kubitschek's estate, notes for an opera written by Adolf Hitler were found. Wieland the Smith was intended to complete Richard Wagner's work. Such arrogance.
The few notes we have consist of a grand introduction that is reminiscent of Wagner. The music has a touch of mythomania and is rather lavish. Strangely enough, after 3 or 4 bars, there is a break, and a kind of fugue begins. But it's not really a fugue. The score then covers various tessituras and sounds relatively modern. So it's not so much 19th century Wagner as the sound of a new form of musical expression. I don't think Hitler wrote it at all. In my opinion, he and his friends sat together one afternoon or evening and chatted about the opera, possibly about a performance of a Wagnerian opera they'd just been to, and that there was a piano in the room. It could well be that Hitler played 3 notes, and that his friend Kubitschek, who was very musical and had also had a full music education at college, then played around with the notes.
Hitler said, "I'm brilliant. Just like I can rebuild cities, I can, of course, also complete an opera by Wagner."
But Hitler's purported opera remained a fragment. All he could produce were a few lines of notes for a prelude. In his enthusiasm for the reactionary, mixed style of the Ringstrasse and the serial buildings of the Wilhelmina era, the emergence of Viennese modernism, Art Nouveau, went unnoticed by the young man from Linz. Hitler, the supposed artist, rejected the great artists of his day. He never saw the paintings of Gustav Klimt. He did not visit the Great Art Exhibition of 1908, at which Klimt's The Kiss went on display for the first time. The expressionism of Oskar Kokoschka remained alien to him, as did the radicalism of Egon Schiele, who was roughly the same age as Hitler. Equally alien to him was the music of Gustav Mahler, the work of Alma Mahler and Arthur Schnitzler, the salon of Bertha Zuckerkandel, Freud and Loos.
The world-famous Viennese culture of the time, around 1900, was not a general phenomenon. That, I think, is undisputed. It involved an extremely narrow social and cultural element, but one with an enormous external impact.
Adolf Hitler never really came into contact with this art. He completely ignored modern trends and the avant-garde around 1900, which he regarded as degenerate and contaminated by Jewishness, so to speak.
Up until 1909, Hitler was able to live modestly on his orphan's allowance. After a brief return to Linz, he left the apartment he had shared with Kubitschek without saying goodbye. He found various places to stay, often for only a few weeks. In 1909, Hitler's social descent took him to various warm rooms and finally to a hostel for the homeless in the Kastanienallee in Meidling.
He continued to rely on his orphan's allowance for a relatively long time. So really, he must have been threatened by homelessness for no more than a few days or weeks maybe. I don't think even that should be over-exaggerated. His tough time in the hostel for the homeless in Meidling must have been very brief.
He did some casual work and got into debt. His aunt Johanna Pölzel in the Waldviertel region lent him money time and again and noted Hitler's debts in her housekeeping book. In all, 924 crowns. He never paid her back. To mark the Emperor's Jubilee, a picture album was published in large numbers. Hitler used the photographs as templates for his small-scale watercolour paintings. An acquaintance sold the works to picture framers and furniture dealers. Hitler gave him half the money this brought in. The artist's favourite motifs were postcard views of Vienna from the Michaelerplatz to the Parliament building.
This acquaintance, Reinhold Harnisch, must have managed to find a small market where he could earn money with Hitler's paintings. Hitler also said later that he painted to earn money, although he didn't really like painting. Harnisch had to keep pushing him to paint. Hitler painted just enough to be able to afford staying in the Meldemannstraße.
The men's hostel in the Meldemannstraße in the Brigittenau district was not a homeless shelter. A modern and functional building for the time, it was intended to provide single men with clean accommodation on a temporary basis. The hostel was a socio-political measure taken by the municipal authorities to curb the bed lodgers business, which was regarded as morally questionable. The men had small separate rooms and modern washing facilities.
On average, men stayed at the hostel for about 50 days, but somehow Hitler managed to spend 3 years there, so he must have been an institution in the place. It really is exceptional for someone to spend 3 years at a facility which was actually regarded as a temporary solution.
At any rate, the men's hostel in the Meldemannstraße was not the absolute end of the line socially. You had to be able to afford it. And to a certain extent, you also had your own private sphere. This was a social answer to the bed lodger system, one that kept Hitler from total social decline.
Vienna around 1910 was not only the city of palaces on the Ringstraße, it was a growing industrial metropolis. The speed of life increased by leaps and bounds. Hundreds of thousands flocked to the capital to seek work in its factories. But despite the apartment blocks going up, there was still a massive housing shortage. It was at this time that a new social class emerged, that of the industrial worker. The unfettered market liberalism in the period from 1860 to 1900 spawned new political forces in the form of the trade unions and the Social Democrats. During Hitler's time in Vienna, the Social Democrats were already the strongest party.
It seems to me that in the years between Karl Lueger's death in 1910 and 1913-14 perhaps, Hitler also began to turn his attention to social democracy. He was impressed by the way the party was structured and by its many organisations like cycling clubs, smokers' clubs and children's and nature lover associations, and how easily they accepted new members at grassroots level.
But Hitler never embraced social democracy, which was developing into a mass movement. He despised its officials, who were very often Jewish, and the internationalism of the Workers' Party. At first, the demonstrations and the marches horrified him.
He used, I think, the metaphor of a glowing worm slithering into the city centre, an endless dragon coming in from the suburbs. He never forgot the Social Democrat agitators. He hated them all his life. But shining through this rhetoric of hatred, there is, of course, something that I would perhaps describe as a kind of fascination.
As an artist manqué and the son of a civil servant, he thought he could feel superior to others. He never became part of a city he admired, yet rejected as an ethnic barbel. Vienna as it saw itself in films of the day, the delights of the Prater and the bliss of the wine taverns, recreational pleasure and physical enjoyment. Women self-confidently donning bathing gear. This was not Hitler's world.
He was unbelievably shy, never in the crowd, but only ever above it, so to speak. Shades of his childhood and early adolescence when, it is said, he always had to be the leader, and if he wasn't, he was totally offended and sulked. In 1914, society was still so stabilised that it offered little scope for people like him. After the First World War, things were different. Then, in such a disturbed, disoriented, frustrated and angry society, it was possible for someone to suddenly become powerful, someone who had these unique mental prerequisites, someone who first and foremost was actually a great hater. So, in this respect, it must be said that the First World War made Hitler, but the ideological ingredients were definitely present before the conflict.
He didn't belong at all because he was on the outside. He was a failure. He was the school dropout. He was misunderstood, or he stood above the rest of the population. In some perhaps half-baked form or another, this is something he must have turned over in his mind at a very early stage.
Hitler actually fits into the 19th century discourse. At some point or other, he must have come to a halt ideologically. The way Richard Wagner, for example, forged his anti-Semitism was part of the late 19th century discourse. Adolf Hitler seized on this and, from various angles, established an ideology he found fitting. The hackneyed ideas were there. Hitler said that himself.
Hitler schreibt es selber.
He couldn't integrate into the art scene because he came from a totally different level. He simply didn't understand that, nor was he capable of understanding it. He couldn't fit in with any political organization either, not even with Schönerer's supporters, who would have been a possibility. Vienna simply ignored the young Adolf Hitler.
Vienna before the First World War was an imperial metropolis which had long since become a laboratory of modernism. A young man from the provinces had failed in it, and because of it. With his share of an inheritance in his pocket, he was finally able to leave Vienna, frustrated. "25 years later, hundreds of thousands of Viennese would cheer him frenetically.
Thank you.